used to think that love was enough, that if you showed up for someone truly showed up, they would never forget it. For years, that belief kept me going. My name is Rachel Myers. I'm 35 years old, and for the past 3 years, I gave up everything I had to care for my dying father. I had a stable job in Boston, working as a mental health counselor. I had friends a tiny but cozy apartment and plans to one day open my own practice. But all of that changed when my dad, Henry Myers, was diagnosed with ALS. He called me one evening. I still remember his voice. It trembled slightly, not from emotion, but from the disease already beginning to wear him down. They say it's early stage, he told me. Plenty of time. There's never plenty of time. I knew that. 2 weeks later, I packed up my life and moved back to the small town in Oregon where I grew up. I left behind the city, the career, the relationship I was in. My brother Paul and my sister Christine both had their own families, their own lives in other states. They offered sympathy, they even sent some money here and there. But when it came to the day-to-day care, feeding, bathing, cleaning, sitting with him through long nights when he couldn't breathe, I was the only one who stayed. Dad's condition worsened slowly, then suddenly. The first year was manageable. I turned the guest room into a home office and picked up remote counseling clients. But by year 2, I couldn't keep up. He needed help standing. He couldn't eat without assistance. Eventually, he couldn't even hold a pen. So I gave up work completely. I lived off my savings and small monthly stipends from my siblings. I slept on the couch most nights so I could hear him if he called out. I learned how to inject his medications. I cleaned him when he couldn't make it to the bathroom. I held his hand when the pain made him cry out. There were days I broke down in the shower so he wouldn't hear me. Days I resented my siblings for their absence. But I always told myself they're not here, but I am. He'll remember that. Dad never said much about the others. He'd ask occasionally how Paul's kids were doing, or if Christine had finished renovating her kitchen. But when he looked at me, his eyes softened. "You didn't have to do this," he said once, voice raspy through the ventilator. "I know," I whispered, "but I wanted to. People came and went, nurses, neighbors, friends. But I stayed, through the good days and the unbearable ones. On his last day, I was reading to him, a book he used to love. He couldn't speak, but he blinked when I paused, and I took that as a sign he was listening. When he passed, he was in his own bed holding my hand. I thought that moment was the end of something, but really it was just the beginning. The days after the funeral felt like walking through fog. People offered hugs and casseroles, but none of it landed. I moved like a machine, organizing flowers, writing thank you cards, accepting sympathy from people who hadn't seen my father in years. Paul and Christine arrived 2 days before the funeral. They came separately, didn't stay in the house, and barely spoke to me except to ask where things were. Paul brought his wife and kids. Christine came alone dressed in expensive black, smelling like department store perfume and cold detachment. At the service, they cried louder than anyone. I gave the eulogy. My hands shook as I stood in front of the small church crowd. I told them about Dad's laugh, his obsession with fixing old clocks, the way he used to hum while folding laundry. I didn't say a word about the nights I cleaned his feeding tubes or the holidays I spent alone while my siblings sent photos from their ski trips. That wasn't the place. 2 days later, I got the call from a man named Stephen Hunt, my father's estate attorney. "Your father's will is being executed tomorrow at 10 a.m. At my office," he said. "You, Paul, and Christine are invited." I almost didn't go. I wasn't expecting anything. But some part of me thought, maybe Dad left a note. Or something small. A token. I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about meaning. Stephen's office was in a beige building with bad lighting and carpet that smelled like dust. When I arrived, Paul and Christine were already seated chatting like they were waiting for brunch. Paul nodded. Christine barely looked up. Stephen adjusted his glasses and pulled out a brown envelope. "Your father made several updates to his will in the past few years," he began. "The most recent one was signed 6 months ago, witnessed and notarized. It is the legally binding version." I sat up a little straighter. He cleared his throat. "To my son Paul and my daughter Christine. I leave the house at 74 Elmsworth Drive to be divided equally between them. I also leave to them my personal savings investment accounts and all material possessions to be split as they see fit." I blinked. Wait, He was going to get to me next. Maybe a letter. Maybe something symbolic. Stephen flipped the page. His voice didn't change. That concludes the primary allocation of assets. I looked at him. What about me? He hesitated. There is no mention of you in this version of the will, Ms. Myers. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. No mention at all. He shook his head. I'm sorry. Christine cleared her throat. Dad probably figured you didn't need anything, she said, casually inspecting her nails. You were here for years. You got your share already. My share, I repeated, stunned. Paul shrugged. You lived here rent-free. Didn't work. We sent money every month. I mean, it's not like you were left out completely. My mouth went dry. I wanted to scream, to slam my fists into the polished table, but all I could do was whisper, I gave up my life for him. Christine laughed cold and sharp. Please! You gave up an apartment in Boston and a job you weren't even thriving in. Don't make it sound like sainthood. You weren't here, I said quietly. Not once. You didn't sit with him at 3 a.m. You didn't clean his bed sores. You didn't listen to him cry. Paul leaned back. And now you want compensation? No, I said, blinking back tears. I just want to know why he left me out. Stephen, the lawyer, looked uncomfortable. I'm not at liberty to speculate. I can only execute what's in front of me. Christine stood and adjusted her purse strap. Let's not drag this out. Dad made his decision. Let's respect it and move on. I sat there as they walked out laughing about something I couldn't hear. Respect it and move on. That's what people say when they've already won. I drove home on autopilot. The house felt different, cold, like it had expelled me the moment Dad's heart stopped. I wandered through the rooms I'd cleaned every day for years. I opened his closet. The scent of his cologne still lingered. I opened drawers. Nothing. No note. No letter. Did he really forget me? Did he let them convince him I didn't deserve anything? Or was there something I didn't know? That night I lay awake on the couch, the same one I'd spent hundreds of nights on listening for his voice. Now all I heard was silence. And something else. A question that wouldn't stop whispering in the dark. What if the will they showed me wasn't the full story? 3 days after the will reading, I was still drifting through the house like a ghost. I couldn't bring myself to pack up my things. I kept hoping maybe someone would call and tell me it was all a mistake, that maybe there was a letter I missed, a forgotten note from my father, anything. Instead, Christine texted me, please vacate the house by end of the month. Paul and I are arranging to sell it. There was no sorry, no thank you. Just a reminder that I no longer belonged. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed, then put the phone face down and walked out into the backyard. I stood there barefoot, feeling the cool earth under my feet. The garden I kept alive for my father was still blooming. He loved the daisies, said they reminded him of my mother. I stayed there for hours, just breathing and trying not to cry. The next morning, I was in the kitchen reheating coffee when I heard a knock at the front door. It was Nina, my father's former housekeeper. She looked older than I remembered, thinner, but her eyes were kind, the way they always had been when I was a teenager. She'd stopped working regularly after Dad's condition got worse, but she still dropped by every few weeks to check in, sometimes bringing homemade soup or banana bread. Rachel, she said softly, can I come in for a moment? I stepped aside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd fed Dad soft oatmeal and crushed pills for nearly 2 years. I was at the service, she said. I didn't want to bother you, but there's something I need to give you. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather-bound journal wrapped in a cloth napkin. I stared at it. It looked worn, the corners soft from use, the leather cracked with age. Dad's initials HM were embossed on the corner. He told me to give this to you, she said. Only if something felt wrong after he was gone. Felt wrong, I echoed. She nodded. He was worried, Rachel. About the will. About Paul and Christine. He said he might not be strong enough to stop what they were planning, but he wanted you to know the truth one way or another. My heart started to pound. I untied the napkin and opened the journal. The first page was dated 6 months ago. If you're reading this, Rachel, then I've failed to protect you. I swallowed hard. I'm sorry. The entries were short. Some were barely more than a paragraph. Others read like letters. But as I flipped through them, one thing became clear. My father had known he was being manipulated. In one entry, he wrote, "Christine visited last month. She brought me tea and started asking about power of attorney. Said she was just looking out for me. Then Paul called asking how much I had left in savings. Said he wanted to help manage things while I still could. He'd been afraid, but also ashamed. Another entry said I let them talk me into seeing a lawyer. They said it was just a formality. I was exhausted. I signed something I shouldn't have. A new will, I think. But it felt wrong. And then in the next entry, Rachel has given up her life for me. I can barely speak now, but she holds my hand every night. The others, they don't come. They never have. I don't want to leave her with nothing. She deserves everything. The more I read, the heavier the journal became in my hands. I turned to the back of the journal and found a small envelope taped to the final page. My name was written in his shaky handwriting. Inside was a USB flash drive. Nina looked at me. "He told me to tell you, play it when you're ready." I plugged it into my laptop and hit play. His voice came through the speakers, faint labored, but still his. "Rachel, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone. I hope this journal reached you. I don't know what Paul and Christine showed you, but if they change the will, I want you to know I didn't do it willingly." He paused, coughing weakly. "I wasn't strong at the end. I let them scare me. They told me you weren't really my daughter, that you didn't have any legal standing. But they're wrong. Maybe not by blood, but in every way that matters, you're my daughter." I gasped. My heart stopped. "What do you mean, not by blood?" The recording continued. "You probably already know, or maybe you never questioned it. You always called me Dad, and I always let you. But you came into my life when you were 6. Your mother, Allison, was a friend. She was sick. She asked me to take care of you. She passed away 2 months later. And I did what I knew was right. I sat frozen, hand over my mouth. You never asked questions, and I never corrected you, because I loved you as my own. Still do. More than Paul or Christine ever let me love them. You were the one who stayed, who cared, who held me up when I couldn't stand. My hands were shaking. Nina reached across the table and held one of them gently. "There's more," she said softly. I looked back at the screen. A document popped open labeled Trust Agreement. It was signed and dated almost a year ago. My father had created a separate trust, one that bypassed the will entirely. He'd placed the lakeside cabin a sizable savings account and a collection of bonds in my name. But the most important part, a clause. If anyone contests Rachel's role as my daughter, biological or not, this trust becomes irrevocable and exclusive to her. I felt dizzy. He had planned for this. He knew. He just didn't live long enough to stop them. The next morning, I called Stephen Hunt, the estate attorney, and requested a second meeting. I brought the journal, the recording, the legal documents, and Nina, who had agreed to come with me. Stephen reviewed everything in silence, flipping through the journal slowly. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "This changes everything." Christine and Paul had manipulated an elderly man into rewriting his will under pressure. But they hadn't known about the trust. It was legally separate and binding. "Can they challenge it?" I asked. "Sure," he said, "they can try, but if they do the clause triggers, they lose everything." I sat in that office for a long time after Nina left, just staring out the window. For 3 years, I thought I was doing what a good daughter should do. And it turns out I wasn't a daughter at all, at least not by blood. But in his eyes, I was more than that. I was chosen. I didn't sleep that night. The wind outside rattled the old windows, but I barely noticed. My thoughts kept circling back to one thing: I wasn't his real daughter. But he loved me more than the ones who were. I turned the pages of the journal again and again, as if I might find something new, something I missed. My father, Henry Myers, had kept this truth buried not because he was ashamed, but because he'd made a choice. He had chosen me, and he never looked back. But now that I knew the truth, questions rushed in. Who was my biological mother, Allison? Why had she never told me the truth? Why did Paul and Christine know and I didn't? And most of all, why had they been so quick to erase me? The next morning, I called Nina again. She arrived just after noon carrying an old metal box. "This belonged to your mother," she said. "Allison." I hesitated before opening it. My hands were cold, my fingers stiff. I lifted the lid slowly. Inside was a stack of letters, faded photographs, and a birth certificate. Rachel Ann Walters, born in 1988. Mother Allison Walters, father unknown. There was also a photograph of a young woman holding a baby. She had soft eyes, a tired smile, and she looked so much like me it made my chest tighten. On the back, in faint blue ink, "To Henry, thank you for keeping her safe." I looked up at Nina. She really was sick, wasn't she? Nina nodded. Cancer. She fought hard, but when the end came, she didn't want Rachel to go into the system. She trusted your father more than anyone. They were close, not romantic, not in the end, but bonded by something deeper. I held the photo like it might vanish. My whole life had been one version of a story. Now I had to rewrite all of it. "She left you with him," Nina said, "because she knew he'd love you the way a real father should. And he did. But why didn't he tell me?" Nina looked down at her hands. "Maybe because he didn't want you to feel like an outsider. Maybe he wanted to believe you'd never need to know." But I did need to know. Not because it changed how I felt about him, but because it explained everything else. Suddenly, so many memories snapped into place. Paul telling me once when I was 12 that I wasn't really one of them. Christine calling me Henry's little charity case during a Christmas fight. The way family photos always had me off to the side, never in the center. They had always known. And they had always resented me. I think Dad had hoped that time would change things. That if we all grew up under one roof eventually, we'd love each other like siblings. He was wrong. And now that he was gone, they didn't even pretend. Christine had texted me again the night before. "Please remember to be out of the house before the 30th. We've scheduled an appraiser." I didn't reply. A week later, I drove out to the cabin by the lake. It was about 2 hours outside the city. I hadn't been there in over a decade. I remembered going there as a kid, just Dad and me on weekends. He'd say it was our place, and I thought it was because I was his favorite. Now, I knew why. The cabin was still standing tucked behind tall trees and overgrown bushes. The key fit easily. Inside, it smelled of cedar and dust. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a loft with a bed that still had flannel sheets on it. Everything was quiet, peaceful, mine. I opened the drawer beside the bed and found a thick manila envelope. On the front, in Dad's handwriting, "For Rachel. Only if things go bad." Inside were copies of the trust documents I'd already seen, but also more bank statements, utility bills. Even a letter addressed to the county assessor confirming that the cabin was gifted to me in recognition of care and loyalty beyond blood. At the bottom of the envelope was one final letter. "Rachel, if you're reading this, then my worst fears came true, and I'm sorry. I should have protected you more while I was alive. I should have told you everything, but I hoped maybe foolishly that love would be enough to hold this family together. I see now that it wasn't. I want you to know something clearly. I chose you. I raised you. I loved you with my whole heart. That's more than I can say for the other two. You don't owe them anything. I hope you'll take this place and this freedom and make something beautiful with it. Not just for you, but for the little girl I found crying in a hospital hallway all those years ago. She deserves peace. You deserve peace. Love, Dad." I sat on the floor of that cabin and cried like I hadn't cried since the night he died. Not because I was hurt, because I was free. 2 days later, I made a decision. I contacted Stephen Hunt and told him I had no intention of fighting for a share of the estate. Let Christine and Paul have the house, the money, the furniture. I didn't want it. Instead, I asked Stephen to send them a certified letter. It included copies of the trust, the legal protections it carried, and a personal note from me. "I know what you did. Dad knew too. He just couldn't stop you in time. You can keep what you stole, but you can't take what he gave me. Don't contact me again. Rachel Stephen called me a few days later. They're furious, he said. Christine threatened legal action. Paul tried to claim the trust was a forgery. But they can't touch it, I said. No, and if they try, the clause kicks in and they lose everything. Then let them scream into the void, I said quietly. He chuckled. That's one way to put it. I stood on the porch of the lake house watching the water shimmer. The sun was setting. Birds called to one another in the trees. I hadn't heard a single car all day. I hadn't realized how much noise I'd been living with inside and out. Now all I heard was silence and peace. The morning after I sent the letter, I woke up to the sound of birds tapping at the cabin window. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without dreaming about feeding tubes or hospital alarms. I made coffee barefoot in the quiet kitchen and looked out at the lake. The world didn't feel like it was pressing in on me anymore. I wasn't fighting for air. But I also knew the silence wouldn't last forever. Christine called once. I let it ring. Then she texted, "You're overreacting. We can talk about this like adults." No. Then Paul tried. I didn't know what Christine was planning. I was just following her lead. I never wanted to hurt you. He was lying. He'd known. They both had. I didn't reply to either of them. It wasn't about revenge. I didn't want payback. I wanted peace. And I realized something sitting on the porch of that little cabin. Peace doesn't always come from winning. Sometimes it comes from walking away while you still have your dignity. So that's what I did. Over the next few weeks, I began quietly rebuilding my life. I called a few of my former clients from Boston, those who still reached out occasionally, and let them know I was available again. Not in the city, but virtually. A few said yes. Word spread slowly. Within a month, I had a handful of clients and a routine. I also found myself writing again, something I hadn't done since college. Late at night, I sat on the old porch with a notebook in my lap, documenting everything. Not just what happened, but how it made me feel. What it taught me. One entry simply read, "They took the house, but they never built it. They took the money, but they never earned it. They tried to take my place, but I was never standing in theirs." In the town nearby, I met people slowly. An older woman named Judy ran a bookstore and asked me one day if I wanted to lead a journaling group for women caregivers. I said yes. That's how it started. Not with a grand plan, but with a choice. One after another. Saying yes to people who saw me. Saying no to the ones who didn't. Letting go of family that used my silence as permission. Letting in strangers who offered nothing but kindness. Christine and Paul tried one more time. A formal letter from a new attorney claiming I was mentally unstable, unfit to manage a trust of that size. They wanted to trigger a competency hearing. Stephen laughed when I showed him the letter. "They don't have a case," he said. "And if they try, they activate the clause and lose access to the primary estate." "Let them try," I said. But I didn't mean it with anger. I just didn't care anymore. I'd spent too many years twisting myself into shapes that pleased other people, hoping they'd love me if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet long enough, gave up enough. But love given under conditions isn't love. It's control. And I was done being controlled. 3 months after I moved into the cabin, I invited Nina to visit. We had tea on the porch and watched the light shift across the lake. She looked at me and said, "You seem taller." I smiled. "I think I'm finally standing up straight." She reached into her purse and handed me one last envelope. "He asked me to give this to you once you'd settled," she said. I opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. "Rachel, you always looked out for others. I hope now you'll look out for yourself. There's a bank account in your name, not part of the trust. It's for joy only, not bills, not emergencies. Joy. Use it to do something that makes you feel alive again. Love, Dad." I asked Nina to stay for dinner. We cooked together like we used to when I was little, pasta garlic bread, a bottle of wine I'd been saving. We ate at the table with the windows open, the air crisp with the scent of pine and lake water. That night before bed, I opened a blank notebook and wrote the first line of what would eventually become my story. I wasn't born into this family. I walked into it. And when they tried to push me back out, I chose to stay true to myself instead. 6 months later, I sat on the front steps of the lake cabin, barefoot, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise. It was quiet in a way that didn't feel lonely anymore. Just calm, peaceful, mine. The cabin looked different now, painted, restored, softened with color and warmth. The garden bloomed with wildflowers I planted myself. Inside my journal group met every Thursday evening, and the bookshelf in the hallway now held print copies of my first self-published essays written about caregiving, grief, and letting go. I'd stopped checking for messages from Christine and Paul. Stephen told me they'd gone silent once they realized the trust was airtight. I heard they sold the house quickly, split the money, and went back to their lives. I didn't feel anger toward them anymore. What they did was wrong, selfish, manipulative, cruel, but I wasn't carrying their choices on my back anymore. I had let it go. More than that, I had let them go. And in their place, I'd made room for something better. Nina visited often. Judy from the bookstore had become one of my closest friends. Even some of my clients from Boston had come to visit, curious about this hidden corner of Oregon I now called home. They brought wine, laughter, and stories. One of them brought her teenage daughter, who sat on my dock sketching for hours while I read nearby. It was simple, but it was real. That's what mattered. Because here's what I've learned. Family is not about who shares your DNA. It's about who shows up, who listens, who stays. I wasn't my father's biological daughter, but I was the one he trusted with his truth, with his pain, with his final wishes. I was the one who held his hand through the worst nights, and he saw me for who I really was. He chose me, and that means more than anything blood ever could. His journal still sits on my desk next to the photograph of a woman I never really knew, my mother, Allison. I talk to her sometimes, not out loud. But when I'm gardening or writing or simply watching the water ripple in the afternoon light, I imagine what she might say if she could see me now. I think she'd be proud. I think she'd be relieved. And I think she'd agree, you don't need to be born into a family to belong in one. You just have to choose the people who love you and let go of the ones who never did. That's what I did. And I've never looked back.